Welcome to API Documentation 2, REST. This lecture is a brief overview of APIs and what will be covered in the course.
My name is Peter Gruenbaum, and I'm the president of SDK Bridge, a company that specializes in API documentation. This course is the second in the series, so unless you are very familiar with JSON and XML and how to document them, I highly recommend that you take the first course in the series, which is called API Technical Writing 1, JSON and XML for Writers. A few acronyms to explain. API is Application Programming Interface, and I'll talk about that a lot in this lecture. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's a method for client devices and servers to pass data back and forth. The SDK of SDK Bridge means Software Development Kit, which is everything a software developer needs to write software that uses an API. Do you need to know programming to write REST API documentation? It can certainly help, but REST is less about programming and more about data. It's a lot simpler than programming, and so I'm starting you off with this information before creating courses that teach about programming.
This introduction lecture will give you a brief overview of APIs and talk about why they are important. Then it will discuss what REST is and how it consists of requests and responses. Then I'll give a brief overview of authentication and authorization, and end with what this course will cover. Throughout the course there will be quizzes and hands-on exercises. The exercises will build toward documenting a sample API. Before you learn to document REST, you'll first need to understand how it works. So the initial lectures and exercises focused on what REST is, before moving on to how to document it. As I mentioned before, API stands for Application Programming Interface. APIs define how two pieces of software communicate with each other. There are several types of APIs, but for this course I'm going to focus on REST, which is a category of web APIs. A web API defines how software systems communicate over the World Wide Web. This means we are talking about communication between client devices, smartphones, tablets, computers, and so on, and servers. There's a website called ProgrammableWeb.com that keeps track of all of the web APIs that are publicly available to use. Starting with the eBay API in 2005, you can see the extreme growth over the last 8 years. It's important to realize that Programmable Web only knows about APIs that are public. People in the industry believe that there are 10 times more APIs that are either internal or just for trusted partners. Oh, and Programmable Web also reports that REST is the most popular style of web API. When you write API documentation, you are writing for a software developer audience, and companies really want developers to use their APIs. If the API documentation is not clear, at best, developers will keep calling support to get questions answered. At worst, developers will quickly turn away and use something else. REST refers to a particular kind of web API. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's not at all obvious what that means, so let me explain. Let's say that you've created a Facebook app that displays a user's Facebook feed. By feed, I mean the list of statuses of all the user's friends. Now, web APIs consist of requests and responses. The client device with your Facebook app will send a request to the Facebook server, requesting, "Please send me the state of my feed." The server responds with the information, saying, "I am transferring to you some data that represents the state of your feed." That's what's meant by representational state transfer. I'll explain more of this in detail in the next lecture. Another important part of API documentation involves security. In order to use an API, the client device needs to prove to the server that it has the authority to receive or modify data. Authentication means that a user has proven themselves authentic by providing a username and password. Authorization means that the API request includes a special token that indicates to the server that it has the authority to make that request. This course will talk about how to document OAuth, which is a popular authorization and authentication framework. Okay, let me go over what this course will cover. There's this introduction, of course. Then I'll explain in more detail what REST is and talk about REST requests. I'll talk about resources and how they relate to URLs. Next are HTTP methods, which are the actions that you take. Then query parameters, which typically modify the data returned. Next are headers, which contain certain kinds of data. Then there's a lecture on authentication and authorization, and then responses. Finally, lectures on writing the API reference documentation, which is basically putting everything all together, and then tools, and then a review of what you've learned. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started.